Earlier this week, more than 2 million people were tuned into a live feed from a Turkish drone.
Night vision drones from Turkey, they are being displaced to there now.
The drone flew low through the mountains in the far north of Iran, through thick clouds in bad weather, when it spotted something with its night vision camera. A spot of intense heat in amongst the chilly vegetation which covered the side of the mountain.
They detected that heat signature despite heavy cloud cover, despite fog.
It was clear that there was a fire.
There's a huge plume of smoke coming from that site.
It was the site of a helicopter crash. On board had been the President of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, the Foreign Minister, 2 other top government officials, a bodyguard, and the helicopter crew. For hours afterwards, the drone kept watch over the site, a distant vigil, while rescue teams tried to find their way to the remote location. Iranian state TV switched to rolling coverage, not of the search, but of prayers for the president's safety. Finally, the search party arrived. Nobody had survived. The death of Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi has the potential to be one of the most significant events of this year. He was a phenomenally important figure in Middle Eastern politics. He wasn't just Iran's president, but he was the likely next supreme leader of Iran. He got there through acts of extreme brutality, showing his willingness to do anything to defend the Iranian status quo. Today, how Ebrahim Raisi became the heir-apparent to the Iranian supreme leadership, and what could happen now he's gone. I'm Bevan, and this is If You're Listening. Some people rise to the top by being visionaries, some by wanting to change the world. President Ebrahim Raisi was a government functionary, and like many powerful bureaucrats, he got to the top by following the rules. No story signifies this more than the one about what he did at Evin prison.
The notorious Evin prison.
At Iran's notorious Evin prison.
From the notorious Evin prison.
I think it's a bit of an overused cliche to describe prisons in authoritarian countries as being notorious, but sometimes it's justified. Evin prison, the notorious, is on the outskirts of Tehran, and it's where Iran has been keeping political and security prisoners for the last 50 years. So these are prisoners who are considered to be a threat to the regime, not just to society. The prison was hell. Untold numbers of people were tortured and killed there, but don't take my word for it. In 1983, cameras were allowed in to look at what life was like there. Male and female prisoners were forced to chant slogans of the regime while they worked, or were brought into a conditioning hall to enthusiastically praise the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. All sorts of people ended up in Evin jail. Right wing, left wing, male, female.
In Iran, Evin is synonymous with fear.
In 1984, the prison came under new management and everything kind of changed. The new boss, Hussein Ali Montazeri, was extremely overqualified for the job. He was in fact the second highest ranked cleric in Iran and had been named as the successor to the supreme leader. Now, the supreme leader is the big boss, the head honcho, the OG, sitting above the democratically elected president in the Iranian power pyramid. They're a theological and ideological leader, appointed for life, who controls the armed forces and can overrule the president on any matter. Montazeri was a big deal. There were big public celebrations on his birthday and that kind of thing. Now, if Raisi was a worker bee who followed the rules, Montazeri was the opposite. Montazeri was a moderate who had a lot of empathy for the prisoners of Evin, because he himself had been an inmate there before the Iranian Revolution. So when he took power over the jail, he was determined to treat the prisoners well. Montazeri ordered the release of many prisoners deemed to have been sufficiently re-educated, and allowed more freedoms for the ones who remained. But as his tenure went on, the jail became more and more full. See, like many authoritarian regimes, Iran likes to pretend that it has a fair and independent judicial system. Proper countries don't lock up political opponents and religious minorities. So the Supreme Leader pretends that those people are actually criminals.
He said only convicted spies and traitors were jailed in Iran, and that none of his countrymen were persecuted for their religious or political beliefs.
Oh, of course not. Well, there's a whole pageant with judges and lawyers and stuff who hand out sentences. But the threshold for being called a spy or a traitor was very low. Just attending a protest or being a member of a political movement aligned with the West or with the communists was enough. The facade didn't always work.
Widespread allegations of torture in Iranian prisons, culminating in recent Soviet criticism of the clampdown on the country's Communist Party.
But it was still important to men like Montazeri to keep up appearances. His prisons would keep you alive until your sentence was up, and then as long as you renounced your old allegiances, you were free to go. In 1988, a sizable chunk of the prison population belonged to the radical leftist militant group, the Mujahideen.
He says, your base is surrounded by the people's Mujahideen. Surrender, there is no escape from the Mujahideen.
The Mujahideen had sided with Iraq in their war against the Ayatollah's regime. And as that war was ending, the Ayatollah decided that the Mujahideen inmates had to be dealt with. He appointed a committee to look at each inmate's file and decide whether or not to give them an immediate death sentence. One of the men appointed to the committee was a 27-year-old named Ebrahim Raisi. He was a man with questionable credentials, but a strong loyalty to whoever was giving orders. He was the deputy prosecutor of Tehran. The inmates were given a questionnaire, and based on their answers, were classified as repenters or were sentenced to death. Hossein Ali Montazeri was horrified. This was abandoning any pretense of a fair judicial system and would definitely lead to innocent people being killed. As the executions began, he desperately tried to stop them. When the Ayatollah ignored him, he marched into a meeting of the committee, including Raisi, with a tape recorder. He hit record and started ranting at them. He said executing the prisoners was the greatest crime in the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran. He said it would backfire on them, that the world would condemn them, that it would destroy their legacy and the legacy of the Ayatollah. After 20 minutes of ranting, Montazeri stopped. The committee spent another 20 minutes making rebuttals. Amongst the voices, you can hear the high-pitched tone of Ebrahim Raisi not arguing back on moral grounds, but on bureaucratic ones. Tired of their excuses, Montazeri says they should refuse to follow the Ayatollah's orders and to stop the executions. And then he hit stop on his tape recorder. But of course, they didn't stop. Nobody knows how many prisoners they ended up executing. In his memoir, Montazeri later estimated between 2,800 and 3,800 were killed. The Mujahideen says it was more like 30,000. The order was broadened to include leftists who had nothing to do with the Mujahideen. Guards from Evin prison have testified to the United Nations that forklifts were used to lift prisoners up to 6 cranes in the prison's car park, each of which held 5 or 6 nooses. The guards said that the executioners worked from 7:30 a.m. to 5 p.m, killing 66 prisoners an hour. This is not due process. This is not justice. This is murder. Montazeri was fired by Khomeini for his opposition to the executions. Eventually, the new Supreme Leader put Montazeri under house arrest, where he remained until he died. Meanwhile, young Ebrahim Raisi solidified his reputation as a man who would follow the Ayatollah's orders no matter the cost. And as he found out, those who protect the regime do very well. But for his role on the committee that oversaw thousands of deaths, he gained the nickname the Butcher of Tehran. Raisi climbed the ranks of the Iranian judicial system and became the country's chief justice, its top judge. In 2021, Iran was holding elections, and he was the supreme leader's favoured candidate for president.
The 60-year-old is seen as the protege of the country's supreme leader, who cast the ceremonial first ballot.
The election was seen as a sham. Well, even more of a sham than usual.
Hundreds of would-be candidates, including some reformists, were barred from running in the lead-up to voting day.
Voter turnout was the lowest in Iranian history.
An election that saw as much as half the country steer clear of a ballot box.
Raisi took control of a country that was in crisis. Western sanctions, government mismanagement and good old corruption were crushing the country's economy.
For a country rich in oil, this queue for chicken shows just what's in store for the incoming president.
The Iranian people were very angry about the cost of living and had been out on the streets protesting about it.
What started as a protest against unemployment, rising prices and corruption is now turning political.
Iranians want the regime to do more to create jobs and reduce its military involvement in the civil wars in Syria and Yemen.
So, was Raisi going to do anything to deal with those problems? Well, how does that benefit the regime? It's much easier to crack down on dissent rather than actually fix the problems that cause the dissent. If you want to find out more about how Iran got like this, how the Ayatollahs overthrew the monarchy and then imposed their ideology on Iran and the rest of the Middle East, we've actually done a bunch of episodes on Iran, so after you've watched this one, you could check one of those out if you want. But Raisi was at home in the strict world of Iranian bureaucracy, and one of his first acts was to give more powers to the so-called morality police. On the 13th of September 2022, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini was in Tehran visiting her family.
Mahsa Amini was visiting her aunt in Tehran along with her brother when she was stopped by the morality police and arrested for improper hijab.
Improper hijab, so wearing a headscarf incorrectly, according to the police.
All she did was show a strand of her hair. I know it sounds ridiculous, but in Iran, the morality police have the authority to pull you aside, to arrest you, to detain you, to beat you up if you're showing a strand of your hair.
She was arrested and taken in a van to a police station. According to her family, inside the van she was struck in the head by the police.
They have heard reports that she was actually beaten at the time of the arrest.
Inside the police station she collapsed. She fell into a coma and died 2 days later. This was a year after Ebrahim Raisi had given more powers to the morality police. But the thing is, there's a lot of evidence that that is the opposite of what most Iranians want.
They want to see the morality police with far less powers. They don't even want it to exist. And they want to see more freedoms for women.
Protests in Iran are not unheard of. But the protests that began following the death of Mahsa Amini were different. They weren't about high prices or unemployment. They were specifically against the regime's religious fundamentalism. And perhaps more significantly, they were led by women.
Women in Iran set their headscarves on fire in fury. They are tired of the morality police beating them up and the Islamic Republic leaders who police their every move.
The protests spread around the world.
Say her name! Say her name! Mahsa Amini! Say her name! Say her name! Mahsa Amini!
The protests spread into the prison system.
An armed conflict had broken out within the walls of the notorious Evin prison.
A fire broke out, and 8 people were killed in the notorious prison where President Raisi got his nickname.
They've executed protesters now, but they've also killed hundreds of protesters, and none of that has stopped people from taking to the streets.
The Butcher of Tehran lived up to his moniker.
Well, as Iran's protests kick into their 5th month, tens of thousands have been arrested and more than 500 have been killed.
The protests eventually dwindled, but young women are now openly going out without a veil, daring the morality police to arrest them. You might have noticed that we haven't told you all that much about Raisi's actual personality or his actual opinions. And there's a reason for that. His personality and opinions were never all that important. Raisi was always a man who followed orders. The Butcher of Tehran makes it seem like he was a villain, but he's always been more of a henchman. From his position on the Tehran Death Committee, to his role as a judge, to his time as president, he always just did what had to be done to maintain the regime, to keep the supreme leader and his cronies in power. He had no discernible charisma. He was an unpopular and weak president, installed in a rigged election, who faced protests against the ideology of the regime. Even his death in a helicopter accident was unremarkable. The regime hasn't even accused Israel or America of shooting down or sabotaging the aircraft. There's merely a weak accusation that the US sanctions meant Iran didn't have access to good quality spare parts for the president's 40-year-old chopper. The primary implication of Raisi's death is the regime will need to find another functionary to protect their interests. The presidential election is set to be held in the next few weeks. Oh, that's the end of the video. So if you want, you can check out our other Iran videos now.
بس که تو روز التماس هر شهید